thank you everybody for joining us today, and I'm very happy that Boudewijn accepted our invitation to this new meeting on the Phinance Online Seminars. And the talk of Boudewijn will be Finance Law and Sustainability, the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And before starting, we remind you of the format of the seminar. Boudewijn will talk for about 40-45 minutes, I guess. And then we'll have the two discussants today, Joakim Sandberg and Arnaud Van Caenegem. Is the right way of saying it? I hope so. And then we can open the debate and ask questions to Boudewijn and also to our discussant if they like. And so thanks again, Boudewijn, for being here today. And so I give you the word to you, and thanks again for this talk.
Well, thanks so much for your invitation, Emiliano. And also, I should take this opportunity to thank you for all the work you're putting into the finance with PH movement and joining philosophy and finance. You've been doing this for a long time already with great success, and we've cooperated in a couple of earlier initiatives. A wonderful edited volume for Topoi, which actually really put that topic on the agenda. So I'm very happy to be giving a talk today on a topic that I think is interesting, relevant from a policy point of view, but also reveals some of the ways in which I've started to think about the interrelation between philosophy and finance. What I will be doing here is very much applied philosophy in the sense that I'm not going to do a lot about very fundamental philosophical questions that very interesting people have carried out in this regard, for instance, concerning the ontology of money or the status of models in financial economics, work that I've always also enjoyed doing with co-authors like Christian Walter, who is present today as well. What I want to do is really to show how certain insights and techniques, machinery, tools from philosophy can be used to shed light on a development in European Union regulation at the moment concerning sustainable finance. Now, sustainable finance is a topic that I think merits attention, and there's great work that Joakim has been doing on this that is very inspirational in this direction, in this area. So I'm sort of building on work that has already been done, but what I think is my addition here is that I show how insights from epistemology, or more broadly epistemic insights to do with knowledge, with belief, with cognitive attitudes, actually help first of all the theorist like the philosopher, the legal scholar perhaps, to understand regulatory initiatives better, but also maybe, hopefully, to give the policymaker a tool that they can use to improve certain forms of certain bits of regulation. So let me quickly introduce the background of this talk. It's a paper that will be a chapter in this lovely book. I wrote down as the date that I expected it to be forthcoming 2022, but maybe it's taking a bit longer. I don't care. I think that this is a great book anyway, and the quality will only increase if we have a bit more time to work on it. And what I want to do there is part of work that I've been carrying out on the interrelation between epistemology and financial ethics. So my 2015 book on ethics in the global financial crisis actually looked into epistemic virtues that and the way they influenced for the better some behavior in in finance, and also instances particularly where a lack of epistemic virtue, or even more explicitly epistemic vice, went against what is desirable in finance. And I looked into credit rating agencies, for instance, mortgage advice, but also the ways in which banks are managed, and in which, well, knowledge generating organizations in general can benefit from insights from virtue epistemology. So that is a background, an overview. I want to briefly give you some background of the action plan and also the concept of reflexive law, because I am going to argue that the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan is an example, an instance of reflexive law, which is quite an old concept in legal scholarship, but I think very useful in this regard. And then I will give you a very sort of, almost epistemological case study in which I look at various elements in the action plan and hint at the regulation that has resulted from the action plan, discussing some of the epistemic topics, and then I move on to a discussion and conclusion in which I give some recommendations of how epistemological insights could benefit legislators. So let me start the action plan. Just to remind you, perhaps, well, surely a large share of the audience knows this. We've got the Paris Agreement, the well below 2 degrees goal, in which we committed ourselves to certain targets that will have to be reached quite soon. This was, in a sense, complemented the same year by the UN Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, which together, and well, there's a lot more to say about this, lead to European climate and energy ambitions that have to be financed. If you've got an ambition to mitigate or adapt to climate change, then of course you have to pay for this. And the estimate that the action plan mentions is 180 billion euros. When I talked to a former PhD student of mine, Jens van het Klooster, he said to me that I was just really behind because the schedule has really been adjusted upwardsly. Other people actually say that perhaps that the estimate was a bit too big. Anyway, I don't know, but what I do know is that we need a lot of money to finance this transition, and that the action plan of 2018 is meant to help the financial services industry, or more broadly society, to actually close that investment gap. And to accomplish that, what the action plan does is actually stating 3 goals. And it's interesting to see to what extent these goals actually are aligned with this particular aim of closing the investment gap. The first one is very directly relevant to that goal, because it is that finance has to be directed, funds have to be directed towards sustainable investment. And we've already seen some regulation that follows from this, the EU taxonomy, for instance, green bond labels. The idea basically that the EU, I'm now really simplifying things beyond what the legal scholar would find acceptable, but let's, I hope they will excuse my sloppiness here, but the idea really is that what we are doing is to define what it means for a certain financial asset to be green, dark green, light green, perhaps also gray and brown. We want to know what is a sustainable bond, what is not a sustainable bond, what are sustainable assets. And that's what is one of the main goals of the action plan. But the second goal is also ensuring financial stability. And here the idea is that climate change will necessarily affect the stability of the European financial system, in the sense that assets may strand because they may no longer have much value. Think of oil refineries that are no longer in use. So we may see changes in the value of financial assets that seriously endanger financial stability of the EU as a whole. So that's the second goal that the action plan wants to realize, contribute or ensure the financial stability of the European Union. And the third element, the third goal, is to promote transparency and long-termism in finance. Now, long-termism is interestingly used by very progressive moral theorists in the field. And when they talk about long-termism, this is often also associated with the effective altruism movement. Then they typically mean something like a time horizon of at least 100 years, but you also hear them talk about 1,000 years. Long-termism in finance means perhaps 5 years, perhaps 10 years. We don't have a very far-reaching time horizon in finance usually, and so the goal of the action plan is really to ensure that future climate-related events are going to be included in financial decision-making. And this is also, or the expectation is that increased transparency is contributing to this third goal as well. So we've got three goals: financing the transition, making sure that we remain stable, and also that we remain sufficiently oriented towards the relevant future. That's the action plan. So what then is reflexive law? Reflexive law is a concept that arose in the writings of a German legal sociologist, Günther Teubner, but was popularized in environmental law by Eric Orts, a Wharton Business School scholar who wrote a very interesting paper in 1994, published it in 1994, in which he gave a very detailed analysis of the various forms of environmental legislation that could be traced back during, well, the history of environmental law in the 20th century in the US. His observation is that until the 1960s, most of environmental law was private law, market-based. You can think of Pigouvian taxation to do with negative externalities. That's the sort of framework that up until the 1960s we were working in the US, but also I think that is plausible to claim in large parts of the rest of the world. Then from the 1970s onwards, what we see is that administrative law is taking over. Instead of a market-based approach, we see a command and control based approach, as he calls it. The US Clean Air Act is an example of this. And what happens when administrative law takes over is that then the executive gets a larger say in these decisions. That's his analysis, at least. And then at some point, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that maybe the executive is overstepping its what it is legitimately entitled to do in terms of the checks and balances, the trias politica, as we'd call it in our country, for a variety of reasons, then there is a change towards reflexive law. And reflexive law is something in which the term reflexive is extremely important. It really is. It is tailored to it's targeted at creating, promoting, fostering reflection, self-reflection among decision makers. Law should stimulate internal reflection, learning. That is, it should provide external pressures to generate internal self-regulation. This is a paper by Farmer and Teubner, Günther Teubner, the legal sociologist, also in an edited volume on environmental law. And examples of these legal techniques or instruments that you can use in order to stimulate the self-regulation, the reflection, are things like environmental reviews, also education and training, procedures for investigation and communication, ex-ante assessments of impact. Environmental impact assessments is also a term that you often see in this regard. So these are, and now I'm sort of resuming my role as an epistemologist, you are seeing here very decidedly epistemic instruments: education, training, review, investigate, communicate, assess. These are all epistemic, epistemological words. But this also leads to a question. Why would disclosure and reporting and reviewing work? What is the mechanism of reflexive law? How can that stimulate the desired sort of behavior? Because ultimately, of course, the aim of reflexive environmental law is exactly the same as the private law and administrative law approaches. We want to protect the environment. So one of the things that I do in the paper, and as far as I see, is really the an original philosophical way of looking at the problem and the question that I raised about reflexive law, is to think of it in terms of a philosophy of action approach. So I take this very standard Davidsonian approach to belief and desires as the elements that explain a particular action without going into all of the details and very intriguing questions that you might ask about this model. But equally, if I were to speak to an economist, I would say this is the expected utility maximization model, because we've got utilities and beliefs or probabilities on the one hand, and they explain on the other hand the actions that ensue from these as a result of the principle of maximizing expected utility. So we've got beliefs and desires, and they lead to behavior. And now the key observation is when a belief changes or when a desire changes, that then the action that you may perform may also change. So it's interesting to see, if you want to drive behavioral change, that then you might want to see how the beliefs and desires of people actually change. And here I relate in the paper, I make more of this than in the talk today, of the idea of reflection, the Kantian idea of autonomy, where I go back to work by John Kreisman, who has a really interesting way to think of the rationality and autonomy of desire changes. He introduces principles like non-resistance and self-reflection, and postulates a principle to the effect that the agents should be in a position to reflect on the formation of desires, and that they should not resist these desires. So the idea here is, if you encourage people to engage in particular epistemic practices, as reflexive law is trying to do, then they or their stakeholders, people who have a stake in the practice, will or may change their beliefs and or desires, and they will do so reflectively. That's the reflexive law element. And this will result in a change in behavior that the legislator deems desirable. So I propose this as a way in which the philosopher may understand the mechanism that underlies reflexive law. And then we can go further, because if we look at the various philosophical elements of knowledge and belief, then we can also distinguish two, or at least that's what I propose to distinguish, two epistemic instruments. We've got procedural instruments that regulate the way in which people gain, process, store, and communicate knowledge. So this is really about our epistemic processes, the procedural characteristics or conditions that these belief formation processes should satisfy. And on the other hand, there are substantive instruments that regulate what in a particular case should be considered as justification or warrant or evidence for something to count as knowledge. So here we have a substantive view of the type of knowledge or the conditions that knowledge should satisfy, or the conditions that evidence should satisfy for something to be of sufficient, well, to have sufficient epistemic status to actually count as knowledge, or at least as justified belief. So this distinction is interesting. I won't focus very much on this in the next slides, not very explicitly at least. But in the paper, I try to show that some of the elements in the action plan are more of a procedural kind, and others are more of a substantive kind, So we'll come to that. So let's see. We've got the action plan here, and my strategy in the next few slides is that on the right-hand side you see quotations from the plan, and you have to believe me that some of these actions are actually they're very likely to be transformed into actual regulation, and others have been set aside or discarded. And I'm also introducing some elements from a report by the high-level expert group that actually advised the European Commission. So there is a bit of unclarity here on the slides, and I'm saying this because in the paper, of course, I make it very clear from which sources I draw here. So for systematic purposes, we can start with the observation that the action plan, again, to recall, is meant to generate sufficient funds to finance climate change mitigation and adaptation. So it's this investment gap of 180 billion euros annually. And the diagnosis that the action plan makes, and also the high-level expert group, is that one important reason why this doesn't work at the moment is investor ignorance. Investors are assumed or are said to know too little about sustainability characteristics, and a taxonomy or a classification of asset types in terms of their sustainability contributions or performance, as well as labels and standards for sustainable products, are going to actually address that ignorance. So we need the taxonomy, we need the labels to learn more about sustainability characteristics of assets. We see this in the plan. These are quotes. Lack of clarity among investors regarding what constitutes sustainable investment is a contributing factor behind the investment gap of 180 billion euros annually. EU standards and labels for sustainable financial products enable easier access for investors seeking those products, particularly for retail investors who would like to express their investment preferences on sustainable activities. And investors may not receive the full information they need should they want to take into account sustainability-related issues in their investment decisions. As a result, investors do not sufficiently take into account the impact of sustainability risks when assessing the performance of their investments over time. So this, very clearly to my mind, can be summarized under the umbrella, under the rubric of investor ignorance, and is really an epistemic diagnosis of the causes that lie behind the investment gap. But there's not only investor ignorance, there's also provider ignorance, because providers of financial services are alleged to lack knowledge concerning sustainability preferences of their clients. The plan writes, advisors should be required to ask about and then respond to retail investors' preferences about the sustainable impact of their investments as a routine component of financial advice. That routine component is now more or less guided by the know your customer type of regulation. So you need to ask your customer a number of questions that, for instance, determine whether they are sufficiently creditworthy to merit a particular mortgage. But in addition to these questions, the advisors, according to the high-level expert group, should also ask questions to their clients. Then we turn to the element of long-termism and the fit and proper test. And the fit and proper test is a test that is suggested in the plan, but is more finds a very concrete elaboration in Dutch central bank practices, and it is absolutely stunning for a philosopher to see the extent to which this includes a whole range of epistemic virtues. So the diagnosis is long-term perspective is missing in finance. I said that this is at most 5 years, with the exception of pension funds. So the plan suggests that investors should have a duty to examine the materiality of long-term sustainability risks. Fit and proper tests of the top of finance, managers, board members of a bank and insurance companies should be both fit and proper to the job that they are doing. And fitness here includes characteristics that reveal the experience and competence of the candidate, whereas propriety includes a whole array of epistemic virtues: veracity, openness, open-mindedness, sincerity, prudence, punctuality. And the idea is that with these virtues, as I call them here, managers would develop an internal awareness concerning sustainability. And I have a note here that I should have printed in some of the other slides as well. So not all of these suggestions are included in the action plan, but some of these suggestions were already in place in several banks, including the Dutch Central Bank, as I said. Now, so far, we've been looking mostly at what I call the procedural epistemic instruments, but here we see something that's really substantive. It's really to do with what should count as knowledge. And this is quite an interesting suggestion. We start from the observation that finance uses models that are based on historical time series, mostly, right? If you want to do research, then what do you have as a financial economist or as a practitioner? Well, it's data about the past. Now, climate change is an event that by its very nature is not included in any of such series, right? We're starting to see some of these climate-related events, but the real threats, the really disastrous consequences of climate change have not yet manifested themselves, so they're not part of our historical time series. So working on the basis of historical time series is highly inappropriate to predict the future, also to predict the financial future. So finance professionals must, according to the plan, complement their methods with scenario analysis to detect non-cyclical, non-linear risks that the financial industry faces as a result of climate change. So here we find a statement that particular sources of evidence should be used to form our beliefs, and other sources should get lower priority, should obtain lower status in a sense. So here there is really, you could say, a call for a different methodology for giving our knowledge about the financial future of the EU a different epistemic basis, if you wish. And this is more or less also true with respect to the accounting standards, the next element here. So far, credit rating agencies and auditors don't include, or hardly ever include, sustainability in their ratings and assessments, maybe only in very accidental, erratic ways. And there are growing concerns that the current accounting rules are not conducive to sustainable investment decision-making. And that's why the plan requires or recommends adequate and transparent corporate reporting on sustainability, and in the expectation that this will not just inform market participants, but also help steer companies in a more sustainable and long-term direction. Well, here again, you see a genuine epistemic reflexive law element, because it is about reporting on sustainability. It's not that auditors are forced to do certain things. Now, they are only reporting certain things, and that is what then will influence market participant behavior. Right. So the question we want to ask then is will this work, and how can epistemology help? Now, the European Commission a couple of months ago conceded the following in a communication that it sent out. While the EU taxonomy, so that's in very blunt terms, the dark green, light green classification of assets, while the EU taxonomy can guide market participants in their investment decisions, naturally it does not prohibit investment in any activity. It doesn't prohibit investment in any activity. You can still do what you want. There is no obligation on companies to be taxonomy aligned, and investors are also free to choose what to invest in. But equally, the Commission writes, everyone will have a chance to make a tangible positive impact on the climate, environment, and society if they desire to do so, and this will increase the demand for financial instruments and products with sustainable investment strategies. And my question here is this so very simple, right? Simply creating a chance to make a tangible positive impact is that going to actually lead to that change? Is that increasing the demand for the required sort of financial instruments and products? Well, the assumption of the action plan is that that it does something by providing information. And what I now want to do is go back to the Davidsonian model of belief and desire, the belief-desire framework of action explanation, and look at changes both at the level of beliefs and at the level of preference, and see what will happen then. So is the action plan going to lead to a belief change? That's the first question I ask. Well, the assumption we saw was that the action is that there is a great deal of ignorance among investors, so they need more information. But now ask yourself the question, what investor actually needs that additional bit of information in order for them to be persuaded to move their money to greener projects, simplistically put? If it's only a matter of changing beliefs, then we should assume that this investor already has green preferences. But such an investor who already has these green preferences will already see that they have sufficiently many investment opportunities. It's no secret that a green investor can invest all their money in green funds at the moment, even in the absence of an EU classification. So perhaps we've got people who are not yet there. So they've not yet decided to move their funds to green assets. But then, why do we expect the EU taxonomy, which is quite a complex instrument to my mind at least, why would a wait and see investor be moved exactly by this particular EU taxonomy? Why not wait until there is a global standard? Or why not wait until their preferred broker or their bank is going to do their own labeling and helps them to contribute to green projects? What is the specific role of the EU in this regard? So I've no answers to these questions, in the sense that I put them here as sort of a potential form to criticize the plan, but I think they show that we should be more skeptical about this belief change route than maybe some of the authors of the action plan actually are. So maybe what the reflexive law instrument is going to do is preference change. Now, it's certainly possible, as I show in the paper with a couple of cases, that the mere provision of information changes your preferences. So to look at the effect of reflexive law on this type of investor, we need to imagine an investor that is not yet green or not green. So will the EU taxonomy, to use that example again, persuade that particular investor to change their preferences? So to change the preference of, say, investing in fossil fuel to invest in wind energy. Well, then we need to look at what this instrument actually provides, what sort of information it provides. It is only some information about the greenness of a particular asset. It's not information that explains why it is important to invest in green projects. It is not information about climate emergency itself, for instance. So arguably, in order to become a green-minded investor, you need more than just information that there are green assets. You need information to the effect that it is actually worth changing your preferences because you want to help avoiding the climate emergency or address or mitigate climate change. So I think that here the type of information is not of the right kind if the target is to change preferences. Now we might say, okay, this is taking things a bit too literal. And I'll make a short excursion through one of the most, well, at least the most amusing dialogues, I think, in philosophy, the Meno, but also quite an insightful discussion of the concept of knowledge. Because here in this dialogue, Plato or Socrates actually asks the question, what is so valuable to knowledge? Or actually, it is Meno, his interlocutor, who asks that question to Socrates, and Socrates then says, well, knowledge is more stable. It is something that you don't lose as quickly as a belief. A belief is something that is not tightened, not tethered to the truth. It is something that you may lose very quickly. Now, to make people actually reflect, it may be the case that merely providing information may be insufficient. Information should also make the climate emergency and also the potential role of finance in mitigation and adaptation more salient. It should aim at creating knowledge. Knowledge is something that rests on foundations and is connected with all sorts of other bits of knowledge. You want to know something about the emergency, you want to know something about the need for finance to step in, and you want to know something about your potential role in this whole process. And that happens when people gain genuine knowledge and awareness of issues. And the idea is that some reflexive law instruments may exactly do that. Good reflexive law instruments are actually directed at creating that sense of knowledge and salience. At least that is what I argue in the paper. And then, of course, we are asking ourselves the question: what are the best ways for the legislator, the policymaker, to create that salience, to create that knowledge? And I listed a number of, or I went through a number of very recent empirical studies that might actually help us here. To show how our perception of the urgency of investing in climate change mitigation and adaptation is very context dependent. So basically what I want to argue in the paper is that we can apply two strategies to make things more salient and to create the knowledge that is as stable as Meno and Socrates want to have it. And of course, the paper gives more detail about this. I'm very brief here. So providing different bits of information is something that transpires when you look at a couple of interesting studies here. For instance, it turns out that COVID-19 decreased the appetite for sustainable investing, even though COVID-19 is, in a sense, of course, a disaster with long-term effects, but climate disasters have a positive effect. So after a climate disaster attributed to climate change, we find that there is an increase in sustainable investing. That means that communicating that these events may actually be much more effective than the EU taxonomy, the labels, and the benchmark. You want to give people information not about financial, you don't want to give financial information, but you want to give information about concrete climate-related events. But there's also something about, there's another maxim that I would like to put forward here, and that's the last thing I want to do in the talk today, and that is to provide information differently. It's interesting to see, for instance, in a wonderful experimental study that was presented by Isabella Coe a while ago, and I should also say that this is mostly work in progress, so with all the disclaimers in place, reading sustainability reports does not affect investment decisions. Well, that's exactly what is one of the premises of the action report, that it does, the action plan. Sustainability auditing is going to channel funds to green project. That doesn't seem to work, at least not in the experimental conditions of Isabella Coe and co-authors. On the other hand, the visual system that was adopted to represent rankings, to represent sustainability rankings at Morningstar, was shown to indeed increase demand for sustainable finance. This is a very simple visual system. It's nothing highbrow, it's nothing very contentful. It's just a way to represent the information, and Hartzman and Sussman showed this in a paper in the Journal of Finance. So not only do we need to provide different sorts of information, different bits of information in order to make the climate emergency sufficiently salient to the investing public. We also want to provide information in different ways. Sustainability reports may not be the best way forward. So the action plan in the end should be more sensitive to these insights from behavioral economics and psychology that we're increasingly getting about the way in which we process information and ultimately indeed change our behavior for the better. That was the end of the talk. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Boudewijn, for your very interesting talk and your insights, and so it's thought-provoking, and I guess that our discussants will have a lot to say about it. And so now it's time to Arnaud to comment your paper, and so I give the word to him, and I would thank Arnaud for being here today, and thank you very much, Arnaud, for being part of the Phinance Network and the Phinance Project.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, start with a disclaimer, maybe. I am coming from a legal background, and so Boudwjin kindly asked me to read this paper, especially from that perspective. But it was also nice to read it as some kind of criticism on reflexive law more broadly. And then especially the event leading to this paper being one of my, the subject of my PhD now, which is the action plan financing sustainable growth, as really presented here as the archetype of reflexive law. Let me first jump for the discussion to the main claim that you make, which is that for reflexive law to be effective and lead to the intended reflection and in turn the behavioral change, the information that is provided to the investor should not only generate knowledge, but that knowledge must also be saliently cohere with a wider body of knowledge. And then you provide two examples in the paper. So when it's information that is also coherent with our knowledge about climate disasters, you also mentioned that, but then you also mention the investment gap. And then you make suggestions based on this finding that more detailed information about these environmental disasters at the moment when the investment decision is made might cause belief or preference revision, which then again lead to the intended behavioral change. So we activate the knowledge that is needed that will steer investors towards more sustainable finance, and that will be more effective rather than give them explanations about the highly technical regulations. But in your suggestion, I don't know whether that was in purpose, you only talk about information about the climate-related disasters. And I was wondering whether that isn't then too selective if we really strive to providing knowledge to investors. For instance, what about the knowledge of their actual involvement, or the actual impact that can be expected from investors like you and me that are engaging in sustainable finance? And I think we might face a problem there, which is much deeper in the action plan. And that's the question whether the goal to reorient capital flows actually overlaps entirely with the investment gap you mentioned earlier. So one reading could be that the investment gap is really about the projects where we lack money for. And so only but for the investment decision that you make. So as really a condition sine qua non, if you do not take this investment decision, then this project, which will tackle climate change, will not be executed. So that's what in the literature is also called the need for additionality. But of course, most financial products that invest in projects with additionality are not available to investors like me and you and the investors that the action plan has in mind. So even certain funds that needs to have certain low risk profile investments may not qualify for these type of investments that actually have additionality. Meaning that financial law actually excludes us from these projects because they are too risky. For example, you also mentioned the need to ask for sustainability preferences as part of the suitability test in the MiFID framework. And again, that's already become law. And now we see that in the law, you first have to look at the risk profile of the investor and then ask for his sustainability preferences. So you start to see a clear hierarchy of investor protection as a goal of financial regulation, which comes at the top. And then the goal to reorient capital flows towards sustainable investments, which is then kind of subsidiary to that goal of investor protection. And so to relate back to the article, so even the investor, when he becomes aware about climate change at the moment of the investment decision, may still decide not to invest sustainably because he has a perceived lack of impact of his investment. So when a financial advisor offers him certain options to invest in, these will primarily be shares in public companies or funds or government bonds. So in other words, it's not really the impact of the investment decision on the creation of certain new sustainability projects that would otherwise not happen without the investor's investment decision. And so if we then talk about, we need to include more knowledge about sustainable finance, would that then also include knowledge, for instance, about economists that do not have consensus about whether buying or selling shares has indeed an impact on the sustainable transition? Even if we know that such information may indeed mitigate the awareness that we then just created by implementing your proposal from your paper. That was my first comment. I don't know whether I should give the other ones directly or.
Yeah, okay. You can go on.
Okay. So then I have a little bit more general comment as well related to this goal of reorienting capital flows again. So if we assume that it indeed doesn't always overlap with the societal problem that underlies this, which is closing the investment gap, then we can also ask the question, then what exactly is this reflexive law trying to do? And maybe the purpose of this reflexive law is to create reflection and actually try to really contribute to some kind of overall societal pressure on companies, who then in turn indirectly as a consequence may indeed invest more in certain sustainable projects that indeed overlap with then the investment gap. And so I tried to answer this question by putting the policy proposals that appear in your paper, including the one from yourself, next to each other. And in my analysis, I'm not quite sure where I should put your ID. So maybe you can help me out with that after my discussion. So first, let's start with the proposal of the Commission, which you discussed already, is to ask the question for the preferences. And then you could say, yeah, well, that obligation is really meant to get knowledge about the sustainability preferences in order to be able to respect them. And so it really aligns with the goal of protecting the investor, so investor protection. And at the same time, it overlaps with that goal to reorient capital flows towards sustainable investments. But once you go beyond asking for preferences, which you seem to propose, but also create some kind of environment in which we can influence behavior for the better. Because let's say at the moment of the investment, we give you information about climate change, which will make it more likely that you invest sustainably. I wonder whether these objectives of investor protection and then reorienting capital flows still overlap, or do we start to tilt a little bit more towards the goal to reorient private capital towards sustainable investments? And is that then still compatible with investor protection? Or could we, for instance, argue that we create, let's say, if you say there's a risk for investor protection because now there starts to emerge some kind of misleading environment in which the actual impact that the investor can make for climate change is much smaller than the totality of the challenges that we face. So that kind of emerges an expectations gap if the investor, if you do not only ask for the sustainability preferences, but then you give him information about climate change. That's just one of the risks that I tell you here on the top of my head. But the idea is really that you then start to tilt a little bit more to one of the objectives, and maybe at the cost of investor protection. And to really put that sharp, there are some authors that also argue that you could also go further. Especially in the financial advice context, they say that you could, per default, select only sustainable investments. And it's only when the investor asks for conventional products that you select these. And so then the perception of autonomy is, of course, completely different than you put forward in your paper. But the solution is also to get more money towards sustainable investments. And so maybe also in a more efficient way than your proposal. So that's more clear cut towards the objective of reorienting capital flows towards sustainable investments, and that's not much to do with the protection of the investor. So I really like the solution that you propose in your paper, because it strikes a balance between getting more capital towards sustainable investments while at the same time respecting the autonomy. But might there also be some kind of investor protection concerns? Like I said before, for instance, because you may get the impression that you actually contribute to the investment gap, whereas you're just buying and selling shares, for instance, or because the impact that you perceive to have on the challenge of climate change are far little than is maybe communicated to you if you also get information at the time of investment about climate change. And then I have a final comment, which is it's much more your reflection on where we stand right now, because you also mentioned taxonomy regulation and these dark green and light green financial products. And so what you say in the paper, and that's also true, like the action plan first said we're going to clarify the existing duties of asset managers and financial intermediaries, but what it did in practice is then went a bit further. And so when you talk about light and dark green, that relates primarily to the division that we see in the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. And in essence, it means that you as an asset manager, you need to classify your funds, either under the first category, which is the funds that have sustainable investments as their objectives, or the second category, which are the funds that promote environmental or social characteristics. That as such has not so much to do with the taxonomy. Taxonomy is more about how do we define environmental sustainability at the level of the economic activity, but it also has relevance for this categorization, because this categorization leads to the fact that you can use certain templates and you need to classify you under one of these two categories in order to be able to communicate about sustainability. And as part of that communication, you may also give information about your taxonomy aligned investments, so investments that also align with the economic activities that are environmentally sustainable under the taxonomy. But now my question would be, so you have these two categories of which the purpose is simply to regulate communication. So we say only these funds can communicate about sustainability. All other funds that do not qualify under these two categories of light and dark green products may not communicate about sustainability. And the European Union then clearly said that that is not a labeling mechanism. But what we see in the industry is that they actually start to use these categories as a label. And so, in fact, I already defined them, but it's to have sustainable investment as your objective or to promote environmental or social characteristics. These aren't very clear-cut legal terms. And so what you see is that once the industry started to use these rather empty categories, a set of undefined standards leading to some convergence about what a sustainable fund means in EU law started to emerge. And so my question would be, is that then a prime example of what reflexive law should do? Because there's now criticism that we hear that this could also be a source of some legalized greenwashing, because no one knows what these definitions mean. And many authors are actually arguing that these categories should be more substantively defined, which also mean that you leave the more transparency objective that you had initially, but indeed evolve towards some kind of a labeling mechanism, which was not the intention of the European Union. So is that reflexive law by example or not? And so let me stop there. And in conclusion, I really think this was a very nice paper to read. There's a lot of innovation in it. So the focus on the dynamics of reflexive regulation at the level of the individual decision maker, some general takeaways about reflexive law also beyond the action plan, and also the idea that main instruments of the action plan are indeed reflexive. Were very innovative and insightful. So I really enjoyed it. And I hope that I can spark some debates with my comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arnaud. And now we move to Joakim comments, I guess. And so then we can have the debate all together. Yeah. Thank you again, Arnaud.
Thank you, Emiliano, and thank you, Boudewijn, for your paper. And I'm sorry that you don't get to respond yet, because I guess you're very eager to do that. So I had imagined more of a back and forth. But let me just go through some of my main comments. You know, I think this is a wonderful paper because, you know, the topic first and foremost is just super important. How do we steer finance, and therefore, you know, where money goes, so the world goes. So how do we steer the world towards sustainability through finance? Immensely important. And I've been involved in this topic for years. And I think the EU action plan is a very central piece here, very important to try to analyze. Of course, it's super complex, and therefore that sort of puts many people off. And, you know, even trying to understand which of these directives is the latest one, which ones are active and which aren't, is just immensely difficult. So I think you've proven here that a philosopher can do a lot here, namely to cut through the complexity and sort of try to find what's the main point of this. I think that you do an excellent job at that. And then, you know, a philosopher can also take it to the next step, namely ask the central critical question: will this work? You know, is this going to bring us what we want? And I think you make considerable headway there by asking the right questions and having some good points of analysis there. Yeah. So so over to my comments more broadly. I mean, I think there's an interesting context here, namely, if you compare the EU structure with, you know, other potential legal frameworks or policies, public policies you can have to try to move sustainable finance forward. The EU action plan is at one interesting end. It's the most sort of pro-market or sort of you know, working within the market type of system, right? It sets to, in a sense, perfect markets. It says, you know, if only markets could do what they do better, then, you know, markets could solve it. So if market only could better reveal people's actual preferences and better spread the actual information out there and so on, you know, markets could help us. And of course, I think it's always important to keep in mind that, you know, there are plenty of other policies possible and maybe preferable in my book. So for instance, for the state to take a more active stance on, for instance, subsidizing certain times of investments or loans, or, which is happening more now, for regulators to take a stronger stance through prudential regulations, macro and micro, sort of introducing sustainability factors. So there is a broader spectrum available for policymakers, and the EU action plan is interestingly sort of in one end. And I think that for perfectly understandable reasons, you know, for many nations to agree on something in the EU, you know, they pick something that's sort of supposedly market neutral, you know, supposedly, you know, not taking any political stance. But of course, indirectly it is, of course, it will redirect market flows. but supposedly, you know, it's sort of less political in one sense, and that's, I think, why lots of EU work is sort of market friendly in that way. Now, having sort of put into that context, I mean, I do that because most of my sort of comments come from that. Like, I think a large piece of evaluating this is also evaluating whether markets, even if we make them slightly better, can really solve this. You know, can markets help us by putting prices better, solving everything? And I mean, so I think you very adequately bring to the fore some things that the EU Action Plan wants to do. So it wants to sort out sort of lack of information when people just don't know what the projects are about, and people don't know each other's preferences and so on. It wants to sort out information asymmetry, you know, when the people in the projects know more about the projects than people outside. It wants to at least partly address sort of investor myopia, that is short-termism in investors, by sort of trying to foster a more long-term thing. So I suppose two questions can be asked here. One is, you know, will it work in addressing these problems? And the other is it neglecting other problems and perhaps more serious problems? So first, you know, will it solve these problems? I think some things to think about is, you know, irrespective of the information you put out there about the sort of the evaluations of the sustainability of versus various projects and the preferences of people, the future is uncertain, and especially sort of the future of how we will tackle climate change is radically uncertain. So in that situation, it seems, you know, just giving people lots more information about how various things interact with climate change is not going to take us to, you know what we need to do and what is expected of us to do to solve climate change, right? So that's, I think, maybe one thing to think about. Irrespective of the information, you know, maybe things are just too uncertain to be able to know what to do. And the other is, I think, you know, about changing people's incentives or people's preferences that you talk about. I mean, I think the action plan does something to try to address this. For instance, it seems like it's assuming that end clients, people like you and me or future pensioners, you know, they will care about sustainability. And then it sort of tries to import their preferences and sort of make it spread more on the market. So fiduciaries need to care more about what their beneficiaries have for preferences in this regard. Advisors need to include more of that. But I mean, at the end of the day, maybe we have those preferences, but as long as there are strong short-term incentives for us not to give too much weight to them now, you know, we're sort of, I wonder whether, you know, the push towards long-termism will make it. So as long as there's no price now on carbon emissions, you know, why not invest in stable, already proven, you know, industries rather than very fragile, you know, startups that are green, you know? So I think even if we care about the environment and we have those, as long as there are clear short-term incentives to go brown, you know, we're likely to do that, at least to some extent. Okay, and then the other major type of question that I said was, even if it solved those problems, maybe there are larger problems looming that the action plan doesn't really address. And I guess those would be broader or maybe structural problems of whether markets can really address this. and one of the things that was related to what Arnaud said about additionality, and it's mainly the case that markets are, when they work well, sufficiently liquid so that if some people don't prefer a certain investment, they sell it and then others can buy it. And so I think that was what Arnaud was trying to say, where even if lots of funds and lots of individuals start to go green because they realize this is the way to go, as long as there's at least a few brown investors that that don't care so much about that, they will still invest in the brown industries. In fact, they can buy those shares at a discount now that the others are leaving, right? So it's suddenly cheaper for them. So they're extra incentivized to buy the brown. So I mean, and that's a good thing about markets, broader, that it doesn't sort of that it should not depend on individual sort of non-market preferences. It should be based on what's most efficient. But in this situation, it becomes a problem that markets function like that. And I think another broad structural problem that I want to address is, the rather minuscule part that clients play, unfortunately, that individuals play. I mean, I think this is a problem in the action plan. It's sort of it's assumed that people like you and me, we care about the environment, and so if advisors would just sort of listen more to us, if fiduciaries would ask us more about our sustainability preferences, things will change. But actually, individuals and their input into markets is rather minuscule. It's markets are controlled mostly by the people with most market power, by the people with most capital, and that's not with individuals. So I think the bulk of the money is not going to be with individuals like you and me, and that's where I think the bulk of the money is going to be with either super billionaires or investment institutions. And that's why I've given so much thought to the idea of fiduciary duty and what investment institutions need to do. And I think just the idea that they should listen a bit more to their clients is rather naive. They have a strong, by law, obligation not to squander the funds of future pensioners, not to squander the funds of their clients. Right. So those were my questions. So to sum up, to go back to my sort of how I put it into context, most of these problems, they arise if we think that, if only we make markets more perfect, everything will be sorted. I think, and I don't think I'm a radical, being a Scandinavian, being a radical communist or something by saying there's a role for the state here, precisely when, societies face large-scale challenges that individuals have a very, very hard time understanding and pricing on a market. And we also face a collective action problem. Who's going to price it? And I can get away with not pricing it, Precisely in those situations, we have a collective agent, the state, that goes in and sort of shows, here's how we need to prioritize. We need to subsidize certain things or guarantee certain loans so that things change irrespective of market participants' interests. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Joakim. And now I think we can give the word to Boudewijn for his replies, and then we can open the debate. So thank you again, Joakim, for being here today and joining us with the Phinance Network. Thanks again.
Well, thanks to the two of you for absolutely terrific comments. This is what is clear to me is that I need to give this paper more than just an extra day editing. It will be more work, only to introduce some of these topics that you've raised, but also to correct a few errors. Indeed, the way I represented the taxonomy was overly simplistic, or probably not totally correct. So thanks so much for these comments, but also thanks so much for raising a number of issues that actually really put this in a broader perspective. I just want to go through these comments more or less one by one. I can artificially integrate, but let me just go from what I've written down. There's really a wealth of insight. So the first is a question actually that both of you asked in one or another way. How powerful are actually these individual household end users, the people like you and me, but also the many people who own a bit more or significantly less, knowing that academics are certainly not unprivileged. Yeah. Of course, the idea is not that this is all we need to change, to end climate change or to adapt to climate change. More is needed. So I think that I find it quite persuasive to say that if indeed the diagnosis of the action plan is right, that investors don't know enough, and that providers don't know enough, and that we need to simply set these people in motion and motivate them to move their money where they should move it, that is a worthwhile attempt to do something to rescue the planet. It's not all. We may need other mechanisms. The state may actually have to step in much more fiercely. I think that is certainly unavoidable, but it doesn't. I don't think that this is something that, in my view at least, would be a very forceful critique of the action plan. It would it would limit the applicability. It would probably also limit the ambitions. But I would realize that the idea that I mean, a free market, that is basically what the EU is about, in a sense, right? I've argued in a totally different context that the EU should also be about avoiding war in Europe. But if you look at the foundational legal documents, plus some of the more recent history of the EU, then it's of course very much about freedom in an economic sense of the words. And I think that is a valuable ideal, but it is certainly not the only solution here. So that is something that I would like to. I think I can concede this. Then the question is what to do when there is lack of consensus about whether our actions are actually going to have the impact that we expect them to have. So that's, I think, also something that both of you hinted at a bit. I think that Joakim was a bit more explicit in raising some skepticism here, in the sense that, well, you sell your Bruin shares to me, and I'm buying them at a discount, and I will profit, and the net result will not be a big change. Yeah, that is certainly possible. On the other hand, there's also money on my bank account at the moment waiting to be lent to someone who wants to use it for green purposes, and that money is not changing from brown to green or green to brown, right? So there's other mechanisms than only shares changing hands. So I think that maybe that there's more to say about this, but there is maybe a more fundamental debate among economists. Is this really changing the world if we move our money to greener, more sustainable projects? I'm not an economist, so I don't know. I don't think I have a position here. So the way in which Arnaud particularly asked this was what to do with the fact that there is a lack of consensus. How are you going to actually integrate this in a reflexive law approach, because you may end up with a situation that we're seeing at the moment with COVID regulations. There's a lot of contradictory positions. One person says we're already in the black scenario. Others say it's certainly never going to happen in the next month that we end up in a black scenario. They're both experts, or at least they look like experts, and the result is not that they inform us. The result is that they confuse us, and that we no longer know what to think about it. And this may easily tempt certain people to think that no one knows it, that there's nothing to be known, or maybe that there is even a conspiracy behind all this. And to the extent that that is true, which is, of course, also an open empirical question that psychologists probably should try to answer, I think there is certainly a risk of providing all these details. Now, if I look at the papers that investigate experimentally or at least empirically the impact of providing certain bits of information to the investing public, it is never that subtle, in the sense that it's not competing views about economics or economic mechanisms, but it's really the event of a certain draft or flood or whatever heat wave that actually really changes a person's behavior. Or it's even more simple. It's a particular visual representation of certain asset classes at Morningstar. So maybe we don't need to go so far in the economic details and still give a sufficiently rich picture of the state that the world is in to actually change some of the beliefs and some of the preferences of these investors. Arnaud also asked the very interesting question that I don't actually deal with in the paper, but I want to try to answer it here, because I think it is a really interesting observation. I must say I've never thought about it in this way, whether there is maybe an inconsistency, or at least a discrepancy, between the obligations that an advisor has vis-a-vis their clients in terms of suitability, or the risk preferences, investor protection, that sort of obligations or considerations, and on the other hand, sustainability, right? So if I force upon you a very, very green investment portfolio, but it is more risky in a sense, then am I actually doing what I'm supposed to do? That is probably a reason. Yeah, that is. I think my answer would be to say that that is exactly why it should be a matter of informing your client and not forcing your client. It's informing your client about various options, and then putting, and sort of trying to characterize these options along the dimensions that the client finds important. One of these dimensions is risk. The other dimension may be sustainability, but the client who doesn't want to be informed about sustainability will not be able to rank these options along sustainability lines. So I think that is certainly part of the action plan's idea. There's no default, there's no nudging, there's no force, there's no interference here. There's only the hope that people will be moved by themselves. And yeah, that may be naive in a sense. On the other hand, the mere asking of a question may already be sufficient to nudge, between scare quotes here, a client in a certain direction. But I'm not aware of, at least I haven't seen or read any research that tackles exactly this question. So I have to leave that a bit unanswered. I really want to underscore that I find this a very interesting question, also from the point of view of, say, consumer ethics. So that will be put on the agenda, and perhaps I can say more about it in some time. Let me see. Yeah, so this is also the question about the extent to which it is compatible with investment protection. You asked a question about autonomy here. Let's answer that question also in relation to Joakim. So I thought I wanted to do it. I didn't expect to be able to actually integrate these comments so nicely, but I think at least now I see some integration here. Should we be more strict? Should we be more of an should our interventions be fiercer in a sense, more forceful than the EU envisages it at the moment? This will certainly come at a cost of autonomy. My sense is that since we're really talking about individual funds, the contribution of which is, as we saw, still relatively small, or at least let's assume that that is true, that other providers of funds may be larger, then I think that it would be risky to give up on autonomy here, right? We already see that when we look at pension funds, for instance, the impact that the individual member of a fund has on their on the way the money is invested is very, very limited, sometimes even zero, right? Only after a long range of protests and letters and meetings with board members, my own pension fund, the ABP, which is one of the largest funds worldwide, moved and decided to divest from oil and other fossil fuel in the next years. That is something that did not happen because people were allowed to vote. That is not because they decided to create certain forms of retirement planning where you had the option to choose between sustainable or less sustainable pensions. It is something that is that was really affected through activism, because there is no or hardly any autonomy in the pension market in the Netherlands. And I think that as long as that is true, and this is a picture that you see in other countries as well, then I think it would be risky to withdraw the autonomy also when it comes to household investing. I think that there are good arguments to keep that market free. There's a lot that I also wrote down, but I think that let's turn to the issue of what you called, Arnaud, legalized greenwashing. I think that is something that really opened my eyes for the unintended or perverse effects of reflexive law instruments, or maybe of any instrument, but in particular here, because this is something that I should look into this, because I've seen some of the things going on. I followed the debate, for instance, about the inclusion of nuclear energy in as a sustainable asset class, and the lobbying that goes on from France and certain other countries, and the lobbying from Germany the other way around. I assume that you would agree that that is a similar sort of phenomenon where things happen that were unforeseen at the moment when the policymakers were developing these instruments. But maybe there's also a significant difference that I don't see. But what I agree with you that this is something that arises as soon as your instruments are insufficiently, or, well, maybe that's a normative term, but when they are not very detailed, and when the details are developed at a later stage, and where the details are part of or are determined in a process that is prone to lobbying, but also, so that's one thing, but also when labels and other, this will also be true for reporting obligations, when they are used by the industry or by individuals in ways that were hard or impossible to foresee. How are you going to introduce what's the interpretation or the marketing value of a classification system, and how will banks actually use this in their marketing? That is something that the action plan hasn't really thought about, I think this maybe suggests that apart from the two maxims of providing information differently, but also providing different information, we should also be aware of the fact that information may also have different consequences, unintended consequences, and that we should be aware of that. The reading of a sustainability report may be seen as a case in point, but that is a fairly neutral sort of thing. The things that you indicate are really honest to John applications of the labeling that, in a sense, misfire, which gives us extra reason to be more sensitive to the empirical underpinning of these instruments, and really asks what you're actually saying is the regulators should ask the empirical behavioral scientists to come up with a particular prediction of what sort of unintended consequences might follow, and that is hardly ever the case as far as I see. I want to turn to Joakim's comments as far as I haven't answered them, and I know that I'm not doing full justice to what Arnaud has said, and I'm always very happy to continue these sorts of debates at a later stage, but just in the interest of time. So, yeah, to what extent do I want to answer the question whether markets can solve this problem? I already said a bit that I see the fact that this is a market-based approach, although not in the sense that Eric Orts introduced the term. I think that combining this with the idea that certain policies might have unintended consequences, I realize that maybe we should be a bit careful about promoting a market solution. And what I mean is this: the investor who gets the idea that by moving their funds to officially accepted assets that are deemed to be sustainable by the EU experts, that individual EU citizen cannot rest assured that he or she has done enough, right? More has to be done. And it may not even be in his or her own realm of influence to do what has to be done. So in that sense, I totally agree that there is a task for other institutions. But I don't think that is a reason to doubt that this is a useful mechanism if it actually does what the epistemic version of reflexive law is promoting, namely to make relevant bits of knowledge more salient. What I realize, for instance, when I teach sustainability issues to people in philosophy or economics or politics, is that the mechanism behind climate change is almost always something that people are very, very vaguely aware of. But now, what is climate change? Climate change is, in essence, something that happens because of CO2 molecules. What happens with these molecules? And then I tell them, well, there are estimates that these molecules remain in the atmosphere for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, some estimates even 100,000 years. And every CO2 molecule sends some warmth, some energy back. And that's what global warming amounts to in my very simplistic rendering. And what I see is that once I explain this very simple fact, and there are more simple facts than this, that suddenly changes the outlook they have. So they start understanding the causal mechanism. Now, of course, this is students who understand the concept of causation in the first place, and they accept authorities of science. But I think that to some extent, our knowledge of what exactly is going on is very inadequate. And because the phenomenon is so difficult to and so intangible, I think that many people don't really see through the seriousness of the issue. I may be hopelessly optimistic that teaching people these mechanisms may change their behavior, but at least I think it should be tried out. So are we potentially neglecting a problem? Do we maybe even suggest that by providing this sort of information and by going on with the EU as the EU action plan suggests, that we are hiding the fact that the future is totally unpredictable and that we don't actually know how to mitigate climate change or how to adapt to a changed climate? Perhaps not. Perhaps that is too much to ask for from reflexive law. Perhaps it is just not the intention to provide the knowledge about what we need. That is something that maybe can be outsourced to the market, at least according to the view that underlies the action plan. But what we need to know, we need to have the knowledge that shows the urgency of taking action. So I do think that it is possible for an investor to at the same time change their preferences as a result of more concrete and more salient information, while acknowledging that a lot is uncertain and a lot will become clear in the longer run. The last point is about the short-term incentives. That's the last point I wrote down here, at least, which connects with the small role that households have, perhaps. It depends a bit on what your short term is. It also depends on how optimistic or pessimistic you are. The outcome of the Glasgow Conference of Parties is, as far as I read it, at least, that maybe the next 10 years are the decisive years. That is something that I wasn't really totally aware of maybe 2 years ago. So if your short term is less than 10 years, then indeed that may be right. But most people have a future that is longer than 10 years. What we already see is that people move from the very dry, hot, or below sea level areas in the US to areas that are less prone to be affected by climate change. You could call that climate migration. You see this maybe also already in Europe. So in a sense, people already take action. And I don't see why this wouldn't be visible in the financial markets. So of course, there will always be people who want to make short-term gains. But at some point, this is the long term becomes the short term, and then that game is no longer available. I think this may be naive. Ultimately, this is certainly an empirical question, but I do think that people are starting to have a different conception of that of the long and short term already. I hope I've done justice to at least some of your very interesting concerns, and I may not have written down everything that you said. I'm certain that I missed some points, but let me thank you again for this wonderful set of comments that will certainly make the chapter better. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Boudwjin. Thank you again also to Arnaud and Joakim. And now we can open the debate. So if there are questions, it's time to do them. And so I have two brief questions about if there are other people willing to ask questions. Okay, Christian.
Yes, thank you, Emiliano. It's only a very short comment. Basically, I'm an actuary and I'm not an economist.
Oh, I can't hear you. I think I need to.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes, now yes.
Okay, okay. A very short comment. Thank you, Boudewijn, for this marvelous topic and very large view on the EU regulation. Basically, I am an actuary, and I just would like to do a comment about specific points of the regulation. I agree when you say that there is a need. You don't hear me?
I'm going to use a headphone here.
Yeah, no, I think that the problem is that your microphone is on your cable, and so you have to take it close to your mouth. Yes, the mic.
Is better here?
Yeah, something like.
Okay, I'm trying something else. Better here?
Yes.
Okay. 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 Just very few words, a short comment about this very fascinating topic from Boudewijn. Thank you, Boudewijn, for this topic. Basically, I'm an actuary, and I just would like to say I agree when you say that there is a need for new epistemic framework. And I would like to emphasize that you're right, because I think it's not a question of ignorance or lack of information. I think it's basically a question of the structure of epistemic framework. So what I would like to say is just a short comment. I agree that problem raised by this EU regulation is due to a lack, not of lack of ignorance, lack of information, but a lack of right way of modeling the future. It's just a very short comment. And just to be more precise, I think there is an interesting issue to be scrutinized about the relationship between the long-term and short-term and the risk modeling, the financial risk modeling. So I would say that maybe something is to be found in a new way of modeling the risk for financial stakes. Okay, so just a short comment. A sustainable financial risk modeling adapted to new stakes of long-term horizons. So it's a very short comment, but coming from an actuarial point of view.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's also a topic that we haven't really talked about in the discussion. So it's really nice, nicely complementary. So most of the epistemic tools that the action plan introduces have to do with the way we process information. It's about making certain bits of information visible, asking questions, providing information, reviewing information, putting a stamp of approval on information, for instance, sustainability reports. But here we are talking about, actually, if you put it in very blunt terms, a prohibition against certain models, old-fashioned historical time series models, and a prescription to use certain models, in particular scenario analysis. Now that is in the action plan very, or also in the high-level expert group. It's very underdeveloped. So how would we actually set up these scenarios? On the other hand, we also have such things in place. Stress testing is a typical example to some extent. But I think that's so. If you ask me, what would you consider to be the best way to go forward? I think that here, in a sense, a market-based approach would be at least the default starting point, because you would want to leave it to the market to develop these models, knowing at least, but making sure that that these models actually are engaging with the fact that climate change is a unique event that has never happened, or at least doesn't occur in our current historical data. Whether scenario analysis is the best solution, I don't know. It may be that a different type of mathematical modeling, the work that you have been doing yourself, for instance, with non-normal models, it may be a case in point. That's not where I have sufficient expertise to say something sensible, but I was, maybe there is too strict sort of a guidance here from the Commission to the financial world, and maybe more innovation would be needed here. My impression, though, is that often people still use these historical time series and that also reflects maybe what Joakim underscores, the fact that the long term is still very short among finance practitioners.
Maybe we could find a relationship between brown investors and Brownian finance.
That's a nice way to put this. So the investors of the past are the investors who use the normality assumption. I think that's at least a nice way to discredit a certain tradition. I don't know. It may be that old-fashioned models have also something to say for the future. What I do think is that it is important to point out that reflexive law instruments can say something very procedurally, but also can say something about the content. They can be more prescriptive when it comes to particular modeling requirements, and that is something that I find quite interesting in this regard. Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you, Boudwjin. If we have time, I have two brief questions. I don't know if you're willing to.
I think we do have time, but I should ask the chair. So.
Okay. Yeah. So we have time. I was wondering if you have.
Great. Yeah.
So very brief questions, and so thanks again for your wonderful talk, and it's a nice example of how philosophers can be useful to finance and economy and economics too, I guess. And my first question is about the action plan. If do you believe that the way they characterize sustainability, I mean the implicit or explicit definition that they adopt, is satisfactory, and if you see something missing in the definition? That's the first question. And the second one is about also if the action plan solution, I mean, which is a market-based solution mostly, is a good way of is a good tool for investors to decide between potential conflict in investing opportunities. I'm thinking of, for instance, of Bitcoin versus green investments. So Bitcoin are not green probably, and also Elon Musk admitted, generating a crash in the Bitcoin, and but that are perceived as beneficial to individual investors and probably also to economy, since is a market-based solution to the problem of currency. And so my question is, what do you think about the action plan as a way of solving this kind of potential conflict? Thanks for your answers.
Yeah, that's both fascinating questions. So first of all, the question about sustainability: to what extent is the action plan covering sustainability the right way? Right. I mean, that's so. I'm sure that Arnaud knows more about the history of sustainability in all these in all its manifestations in UN resolutions, say the Agenda 2030, but also in preceding, for instance, in the Rio Declaration, etc., etc. My sense is that we have moved into a direction in which sustainability is really the integrated conception in which social and economic and environmental concerns are sort of, as I think they call it, indivisible and integrated in one concept. Now, if you look at the action plan, then my sense is that that the action plan is not doing justice to that conception of sustainability, because it is really about largely about climate and environmental issues. So you could say that in a sense it adopts a certain prioritization of these various elements of sustainability. Do I think that that is a big issue? I had a meeting with an accountant, a professional auditor in the Netherlands a couple of weeks ago, and actually with two. And one made the claim that climate change is the biggest problem, and accountants should also step in and do the work that, well, the action plan also supports. And the other, who is working in the Netherlands Antilles, the islands in well, near the US, Cuba, Venezuela, that these people have very different concerns, because they fear that climate change adaptation and mitigation will lead to unemployment and exacerbate social problems that already are quite rampant in that part of the world. And that opened my eyes to the fact that that we're really talking in this EU action plan from, of course, a European perspective, right? Where it is relatively easy to prioritize these issues. So that made me, I think that was a call for humility. I don't know how to actually reply to that here. I must say that personally, I do think that the problem is so daunting and so urgent that we may have to prioritize the way we do it and stick to a narrower conception of sustainability. But I do see that there are also parties that will vehemently disagree with this and want to promote the more integrated conception of sustainability that lies behind the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is a tension here, and that is a tension that the action plan doesn't really seem to address. The second question about Bitcoin and other instruments, yeah. I must say that I will, here too. I think that there's an interesting extra element that has been brought into the debate, and that is that the physical manifestation of Bitcoin, which is of course it's a virtual currency, but it cannot exist without certain processes being going on. The computer hardware has to run if I understand things correctly, and this consumes a lot of energy. So in a sense, Bitcoin is not very green, but it's not very green in a very interesting way, because it's not because it doesn't support green projects, but because the thing itself is problematic. And of course, that makes this discussion really, really difficult. And I haven't seen very reliable estimates about what the carbon footprint of one Bitcoin actually amounts to. I don't know whether that is something you can calculate, but I assume that it will be significant. So it introduces something that is also interesting for people who are interested in the ontology of money, because here the ontology itself is something that is at least deserves scrutiny from a sustainability viewpoint, irrespective of what the money is being used for. So greening cryptocurrencies will have two meanings. It will mean using them for greener projects, but also making the thing itself decreasing its carbon footprint.
Thanks again for your answers, Boudewijn. I don't know if there are other people willing to ask questions otherwise, but I think we can stop here. And
thank you. Nice to participate.
Yeah, thank you, Boudewijn. And we spent 2 fascinating hours around a very interesting subject. And thanks again for dedicating time to this topic that I found very fascinating. And so I hope to see you again soon in Rome, I guess. I hope so, and in the video, but I mean in person. So yeah. Thanks again to you all, and Boudewijn, Arnaud, Joakim, and see you soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.